Welcome everybody to our week on the end of the Peloponnesian War, the beginnings of the 4th century, the century that brings us Philip and Alexander. And after the calamitous conclusion of the Sicilian expedition, the Athenian general Alcibiades wanted to return to Athens, but he feared the intentions of the radical democracy he had fled from in 416 BCE. The anger of the Athenian demos scared him, as well as the vengeance the voters had planned for him upon his return. Alcibiades thus stayed away from Athens and instead ingratiated himself with the Persians. He was far from inactive in his sojourn among the Persians and Pharnabazus, however. From afar, he encouraged the actions of oligarchs at Athens in order to increase his own power. Alcibiades claimed through his intermediaries that the Persian king would actually side with Athens instead of Sparta under two conditions. First, if the Athenians would, on the one hand, change their government to an oligarchy, and on the other hand, this was crucial, that they would recall Alcibiades himself and install him as general. Fundamentally, Alcibiades wanted Athens to change its constitution to an oligarchy, which it actually does in 411 BCE. The government which emerges in 411 BCE at Athens from these intrigues of Alcibiades is called the Oligarchy of the 400, and it occurred in 411 BCE. The Athenian assembly actually voted itself out of existence at this point and replaced itself with a council of 400. But by now, Athens had two governments in power. They had the newly installed Oligarchy of the 400 at Athens proper, but also they had the democratic fleet, which was at this point stationed at the island of Samos. This democratic fleet actually considered itself to be the legitimate government of Athens. The fleet at Samos appointed a new group of generals, including Alcibiades, whom they hoped would get them the Persian support that he had actually intimated was on offer at this point. There were also divisions among the 400 themselves who were in control of Athens. Some wanted peace with Sparta, as always. Some wanted a continuation of the war. Some looked for a middle ground between oligarchy and democracy, that is, a wider implementation of the enfranchisement, not as narrow as 4,000, not as wide as the full citizen body. This would be a body of 5,000, which would include all citizens of zeugatai status or higher. Unfortunately, the Peloponnesian War goes no better for Athens under the oligarchy than it had under the democracy. Peace negotiations at this point with Sparta fail. Euboea, the island Euboea, revolts from Athens, and the hoplites guarding the Piraeus port mutiny from the oligarchy, mutiny against the 400. This actually led to the installation of the wider franchise, the 5,000, which also occurred in 411 BCE. All in all, this government only lasts 6 months before a full return to democracy and the entire Athenian civic body is enfranchised. At this point, the Spartan general Lysander was now commander of the Spartan fleet in Ionia and the Hellespont region. Lysander was a really interesting character. He was not a king, he's not an Agiad or a Eurypontid, but he was related to one of these royal houses. He was a very dynamic figure and a very potent and powerful general. At Sparta, the position of general was called the navarch, or the leader of the fleet. From the Athenian perspective, after some stunning successes for the Athenians, Alcibiades finally lost the Battle of Nodion in 406 BCE against Lysander and was removed from command for the last time by the democratic Athenians. According to Plutarch, Alcibiades met his demise when he fled to the Persian satrap Pharnabazus with his mistress Timandra. He was later smoked out of his house was put on fire, and he was assassinated. After Nodion, things go from bad to worse in Athens. In late 406 BCE, without Alcibiades at the helm, Athens, against all odds, actually wins the Battle of Arginusae and wipes out much of the Spartan fleet. Sparta at this point sues for peace, and this is actually the third time that they've done this since 410. But the more radical democratic factions in Athens refuse, although they will in fact regret this. At this point, however, they were so desperate that they freed slaves to enlist in their fleet for the Battle of Arginusae, which they won. After the battle, disaster struck. The 9 Athenian generals who were in charge of the Battle of Arginusae didn't actually pick up the Athenian survivors who had survived the battle because of a coming storm which was threatening to wreck their fleet. These generals were tried and finally executed for this crime, which amounted to a disrespect of religious scruple. 3 of the offending generals actually never returned to Athens to face trial, and among the number that were executed was actually Pericles' son, Pericles the Younger, the illegitimate son of Pericles and his mistress Aspasia. This hurt Athens immeasurably because these were the last of their good commanders and they were now gone. By chance, the philosopher Socrates was actually holding public office for the only time in his life at this time. He was epistates, that is, head of the council, on the day that the generals were tried. He was one of the ones who voted against their execution. Finally, after Arginusae, at the Battle of Aigospotamoi in 405 BCE, the Athenian fleet are completely wiped out by the Spartans. This was it for Athens militarily. The Athenians were now cooked. At this point, Sparta had actually gotten the help from Persia in 413 that the Athenians were so desperately wanting. Actually, had Sparta gotten help from Persia around this point, the war would have been ended much sooner. Persian help was a crucial factor in ending the war in Sparta's favor. After the battle, Sparta blockaded Athens by sea and also by land through their fort at Decelea. Athens had no food and finally was forced into an unconditional surrender. Corinth and Thebes actually wanted Athens completely destroyed. They wanted their walls torn down and their population removed and enslaved. But Sparta said no to this. Spartans knew, perhaps, that actually the city of Thebes would enter into the power vacuum that would be created by the absence of Athens. Instead, Lysander forced Athens just to pull down their long walls in 404, and this occurred to the accompaniment of flute playing and much celebration on the part of the Spartans. Lysander also forced the Athenians to take on an oligarchic government acceptable to Sparta. Lysander embarked on a very complicated campaign to change the governments of Athens' subject allies to oligarchies, and he installed garrisons in all of these allied communities to keep strict control over their operations. Some back home at Sparta thought that Lysander was setting himself up as a king in this time. At Athens specifically, Lysander set up a board of 30 to rule over the city and write new laws following their, quote, ancestral constitution. This was the end of democracy at Athens, at least temporarily. Athens had gone from the full 30 to 40,000 citizen body making decisions, then to 400 and 411, and now to 30. And these 30 were called by later authors like Diodorus the 30 tyrants. The 30 tyrants abolished the assembly and the law courts and executed anyone who was wealthy and took their property and confiscated it. This is the classic behavior of a tyrant. Wealthy non-citizens or medics were especially vulnerable to these confiscations and purges, but the purges soon broadened to include respectable citizens and also medics. 1,500 are said to have been executed in all. In 403, the 30 tyrants created a dangerous body of Athenian exiles led by a certain Athenian named Thrasybulus. Feeling threatened by these exiles, the 30 requested from Lysander 700 soldiers and a Spartan governor for protection. Now, Thrasybulus was the leader of these Athenian exiles. In 403 BCE, Thebes, who was now, as surmised, one of the most powerful cities in Greece, welcomed the exiles. This action was perhaps a counter to the threat of the newly emerging Spartan Empire that the Thebans foresaw. Now, the 30 expected full Spartan support for their rule. They had been installed by Lysander. But at this point, many at Sparta, especially the twin kings, had grown tired of Lysander's arrogant and hubristic behaviors. Many thought he was probably aiming at kingship at this time. In the end, the Spartan king Agis marched on Attica, deposed the 30 who had been supported by Lysander, and removes power of control of Spartan affairs from Lysander. Agis, the Spartan king, helps enact an amnesty and leads the democratic exiles back into the city to reestablish the democracy. This was in 403 BCE. So this was the end of Athens and the end of the Peloponnesian War. We now enter into the 4th century BCE. An important cultural phenomenon in the late 5th century and the early 4th century is the rise of the Sophists. It's important to understand this phenomenon because it helps us determine how the 5th century was different from the 4th century, how they develop into one another. In Greece, few knew how to read, either the poor or the rich. Learning from books was not that important. In contrast, listening to elders and reciting from memory were the main ways of educating young people. There was no public school system, so wealthy parents employed tutors in the traditional education, which was music, musicae. This traditional education involved first the memorizing of ancient and traditional poetry, second the performance of this poetry, music playing on the lyre to accompany the art. As the century progressed, reading and writing became more common in the 500s and the 400s. It was into this traditional world of education and its changeover due to the advent of technology and writing that the Sophists first started appearing. The Sophists were itinerant professors of higher education. They provided popular lectures and specialized in instruction in a wide range of topics for a fee. They were not associated with a school or single movement. They didn't have a common set of doctrines or any sort of organization. They were completely autonomous. The highly successful careers of the most celebrated of these sophists testify to a considerable demand for their services as the 5th century proceeded. This was especially involved in providing theoretical training for aspiring politicians, something that you might imagine would be very important in the development of 5th century democratic Athens. For example, the sophist Protagoras from Abdera was reputedly the first person to write a treatise on the techniques of argument, and was notorious for his claim to, quote, make the weaker argument the stronger. They taught natural philosophy, what we would consider now science. They taught mathematics and the social sciences, that is, history, geography, and speculative anthropology. The techniques of persuasion and argument and litigation, the study of language, including grammar, literary criticism, and semantics, were fundamental to their appeal. However, these itinerant professors were also regarded specifically by those with more conservative views as people who subverted traditional morality and culture. This was both because of their naturalistic scientific outlook on morality and religion, and also their techniques of teaching. They didn't follow the traditional way of having people memorize poetry, learning the rhythm and the morality of ancient times. They were interested in the techniques of modern argument. They taught these techniques to young, ambitious politicians, and this combination, the fact that they were teaching what were considered amoral argumentative techniques to impressionable young people, this was thought to increase doubt and atheism, irreligion. People came to think that the sophists had no moral values because they often liked to defend both sides of an argument as a rhetorical exercise. Some sophists did, in fact, critically study the underpinnings of morality. For example, the famous Protagoras maintained a form of moral relativism in which the moral beliefs were true only for those communities in which they were promulgated and maintained. So for Protagoras, there's no set moral beliefs. Things are only true for one community if they believe in it, and not true for another if they don't believe in it. The pages of Plato give us even more extreme sophists. These characters, such as Thrasymachus and Callicles from the Gorgias, they both expound the theory that there is no justice or morality anywhere in the world. Instead, we just have the rule of the strong over the weak. All talk of justice and morality is simply a sham. However, it is definitely an oversimplification to simply regard the sophists as a group who had a shared, generally skeptical or radical outlook on morality. Different sophists had different opinions about the value of a general theory of morality. Now, a notable sophist was Protagoras from Abdera. He lived from around 490 to 420 BCE. That is the full scope of the 5th century. One of his most famous quotes says that man is the measure of all things. Of things they are, that they are, and of things that they are not, that they are not. In other words, you yourself, man himself, is the only judge of reality or truth. Whatever you perceive as real or true is also real or true. He questioned what we humans can actually know about the gods, whether they actually exist, what they look like, if they do exist. He questioned how man could ascertain the gods. This is the background for Socrates himself and the trial of Socrates. The Athenian Socrates was the son of Sophroniscus and Phainarete. He was from the Athenian deme Allopeke. He was married to Xanthippa and was the father of 3 sons, so a pretty normal guy. As a citizen, Socrates seems to have avoided active participation in politics, though he fought in the famous battles of Potidaea, Amphipolis, and Delium, and had a reputation for courage. He must have been at least middle class because of this evidence. Now, all of our evidence on Socrates, apart from the evidence of Aristophanes in his Clouds and Xenophon in his Memorabilia, comes from the dialogues of Socrates' famous philosophical student, Plato. Plato's famous dialogue, the Symposium, is an example of these. In these dialogues, sometimes, especially in the early dialogues, Socrates appears as a character, grilling and asking various people about the definitions of certain important cultural words. This is called the Socratic method. Socrates used clever argumentation. He subjected common notions to rational analysis until one often had to admit, the person he was talking to had to admit, that he didn't know anything after all, or as much as he thought he did. Now, in the later works of Plato, the character Socrates does appear, but he's more of a mystical, doctrinaire philosopher and mouthpiece. He's a system builder. So many philosophical scholars thus see Plato's own ideas, like the ideas of the forms, much more clearly in the mouth of this character, Socrates. So the earlier dialogues tell us more about Socrates the person. The later dialogues tell us more about Plato the philosopher. So was Socrates a sophist? Plato says that he wasn't, but the comic poet Aristophanes depicted Socrates engaged in natural philosophy and willing to teach his students, quote, how to make the weaker argument the stronger. Recall that this was a commonplace complaint made against the Sophists. Socrates' circle also included a number of figures who turned against democracy in Athens, including Critias, Charmides, and Alcibiades himself. This may well have been the underlying reason why Socrates was tried and charged with impiety and subverting the young. He was charged specifically with introducing new gods and corrupting the young men of Athens with his teaching. Socrates was tried, convicted, and put to death by drinking hemlock in 399 BCE. The charges against Socrates specifically were the same as those leveled against the Sophists: not recognizing the gods of the polis, introducing new gods. Socrates said that there was a spirit or a daimonion, a guardian angel, who guided his actions. So whether we believe Socrates was a sophist or a philosopher mainly comes down to how we read Plato. Plato was fundamentally concerned with separating philosophy from some of the more negative elements of culture that he saw as emanating from the fall of Athenian democracy. Traditional musical education, Plato was against. Sophistical argumentation, which raised the temperature in democratic Athens, Plato was against. Plato tried to remove his teacher Socrates from the context of the Sophists. Next time, we'll take a look at 4th century politics, Philip and Alexander. Thanks a lot, guys.